once exposed, had no refuge but in audacity. The goal of Adams' diplomacy was not security in any meaningful sense, but rather territorial expansion. British military power barred the conquest of Canada and also Cuba, which Adams predicted would drop into U.S. hands by the laws of political gravitation, just as an apple severed by a tempest from its native tree cannot but choose to fall to the ground, once the United States succeeded in subduing its British rival. By the end of the century, the laws of political gravitation had shifted, as Adams had anticipated. The British deterrent was overcome, and the United States was able to intervene in Cuba in 1898. The pretext was to liberate Cuba from Spain. The effect, however, was to block Cuba's liberation, and to turn it into a virtual colony, as it remained until 1959. Jacksonian Democrats worked hard to shift the laws of political gravitation, matters discussed in another important scholarly work that Gaddis cites by Thomas Hietala. What Gaddis omits is again informative. Hietala describes the efforts of the Jacksonians to gain a monopoly over cotton, which played roughly the same role in the industrial economies as petroleum does today. By securing the virtual monopoly of the cotton plant, President Tyler observed, after the annexation of Texas in 1845 and the conquest of almost half of Mexico, the United States had acquired a greater influence over the affairs of the world than would be found in armies, however strong, or navies, however numerous. He went on to say that the monopoly over cotton, now secured, places all other nations at our feet. An embargo of a single year would produce in Europe a greater amount of suffering than a 50 years' war. I doubt whether Great Britain could avoid convulsions. President Polk's Secretary of the Treasury informed Congress that the conquests would guarantee the command of the trade of the world. The same monopoly power neutralized British opposition to the takeover of the Oregon Territory, title to which had been granted by the will of God, Adams informed Congress, echoing sentiments that had by then become almost a cliché. It is perhaps of some interest that the logic of the annexation of Texas was essentially that attributed to Saddam Hussein when he conquered Kuwait. There are, of course, many differences. Iraq's claim to Kuwait had deep roots, stemming from the days when Britain established the borders of Iraq to ensure that Britain, not Turkey, would have control of the oil of the north, and that the British colony of Kuwait would effectively bar Iraq's access to the sea. Furthermore, Saddam Hussein did not mimic Jacksonian Democrats in expressing his fear that slavery in Iraq would be threatened by independent states nearby, and he may not have invoked divine providence, at least with such eloquence. As far as I know, leading Iraqi intellectuals did not call for miserable, inefficient Kuwait to be taken over to carry forward the great mission of peopling the Middle East with a noble race of Iraqis, nor declare that it is very certain that the strong Iraqi race, which has now overrun much of the region, must also overrun that trace, and the Arabian Peninsula also, and it will in the course of ages be of small import by what particular occasions and methods it was done. To quote Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, speaking of Mexico and the Oregon Territory, with appropriate change of names. And no one alleged that Saddam Hussein, in his wildest dreams, might have hoped to gain control over the world to anything like the extent of the ambitions of the Jacksonian Democrats, always in self-defense and pursuant to God's will. Filling in these and many other instructive omissions, the picture provided by Gaddis's scholarly sources lends considerable support to his judgment about the origins of the Bush Doctrine and its implementation, from Adams through Wilsonian idealism and on to the present. As for the expansion of the precedents to the entire world, others must judge for themselves, and they have. Fear and often hatred of the United States have risen to unprecedented heights, significantly increasing the threat of terror and the likelihood of ultimate doom. The current space-age version of the Adams doctrine, that expansion is the path to security, is having the same effect. The normative revolution. As illustrated above, there is a spectrum of articulate opinion on the resort to military force. At one extreme is the post-war consensus formally articulated in the UN Charter, reiterated at the South Summit, and recently again by the UN High-Level Panel and the UN World Summit a year later. The rest of the spectrum, keeping to its liberal internationalist end, basically adopts the principle that the United States is uniquely exempt from international law and jurisdiction, and is accordingly entitled to resort to any measures it chooses to respond to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige, and to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. I should stress again, however, that the American public appears to keep quite firmly to the post-war consensus that is virtually excluded from the political system and general commentary. At the margins, we do find more nuanced opinions on the resort to force. One of the most important is the study by the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Kosovo War, headed by the distinguished South African jurist Richard Goldstone. The Commission rendered the harshest criticism anywhere near the mainstream of the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, concluding that the bombing was illegal but legitimate. It was illegal because it did not receive approval from the UN Security Council, but it was legitimate because all diplomatic avenues had been exhausted, and there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo. Goldstone suggested that the UN Charter might need revision in the light of the report of the Commission, the conclusion that was explicitly rejected by the High-Level Panel in December 2004. The NATO intervention, he explained, is too important a precedent for it to be regarded as an aberration. Rather, state sovereignty is being redefined in the face of globalization and the resolve by the majority of the peoples of the world that human rights have become the business of the international community. Goldstone also stressed the need for objective analysis of human rights abuses. The last comment is good advice. One question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed the majority of the peoples of the world accept the judgment of the United States, the United Kingdom, and some allies on the bombing of Serbia. Review of the world press and official statements reveals little support for that conclusion, to put it mildly. In fact, the bombing of Serbia was bitterly condemned outside the NATO countries, with little notice in the United States. Furthermore, it is hardly likely that the decision of the self-declared enlightened states to exempt themselves from the UN Charter and the Nuremberg Principles would gain the approval of much of the world's population. Another question that objective analysis might address is whether indeed all diplomatic options had been exhausted in Kosovo. This conclusion, too, is not easy to sustain. When NATO decided to bomb, there were two diplomatic options on the table, a NATO proposal and a Serbian proposal. The latter kept from the public in the United States, perhaps the West in general. After 78 days of bombing, a compromise was reached between them, though violated at once by NATO. So it appears that diplomatic options were available after all. A third question is whether there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, as the Independent Commission asserts, clearly a crucial matter. Here, objective analysis happens to be unusually easy. There is a vast documentary record available from impeccable Western sources, including several compilations by the State Department released in justification of the war, in addition to detailed records of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and NATO, the International Kosovo Verification Mission, KVM monitors, the UN, and a lengthy British parliamentary inquiry. they all reached the same conclusion: the killings and atrocities